So, on today's podcast, we have one of our news and analysis episodes where we not only explore changes to the Disney company with its parks, films, and other entertainments, but also what these announcements mean for the future of the Disney company. In this episode today, we have 3 chunky stories. First off, what the box office success of Zootopia 2 likely means for the future of that franchise, particularly in North America. Second, an exploration of a recent article in the Wall Street Journal that explores some troubles at Imagineering. And lastly, what the coming changes to Disneyland's version of Galaxy's Edge signal for that land, and also, what would it take to bring these changes out to Florida? But before I get to that, I need to thank another round of Bandcamp subscribers. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Our Bandcamp subscribers are the people who keep this whole enterprise going. Without them, we would literally need to close up shop. I'm grateful for each and every person that supports us over on Bandcamp, but today, a special note of thanks is going out to some new subscribers there. These include Ink and Pixie Dust, Ace YRJ, Sweatbox Survivor, Anthony, and Steel City Steve. Thanks to you and to everyone that's joined us over on Bandcamp. And now let's jump into the news. Let's start with this. If you were hoping that the Zootopia characters would have a larger presence in the American parks, I would say that that is now almost surely on its way. Zootopia 2 is the highest-grossing Hollywood animated movie of all time, recently overtaking Inside Out 2. It's also the 9th largest global release of all time once you factor in live-action films as well. Zootopia 2 has been both well-reviewed and well-received by audiences. In terms of likely winners for the Best Animated Feature category at the Oscars later this year, I think it's going to come down to either Zootopia 2 or K-pop Demon Hunters, with an outside possibility of Arco if the Academy is leaning a little more towards indies this year. But I want to break down these numbers a little more by global region. The original Zootopia back in 2016 made over $1 billion. But $250 million of those dollars came from China, which gave the Zootopia IP the identity of playing well to a Chinese audience. In a recent episode, we talked about the reasons for this in terms of how the original Zootopia tied into current culture in China. But in terms of domestic box office, Zootopia 2 is doing significantly better than the original Zootopia in terms of the United States and Canada. Zootopia 2 overall is about 30 slots higher right now than the first Zootopia feature on the domestic list, and will be many spots higher than that by the time its theatrical engagement finally ends. Generally, Zootopia's level of success in the US and Canada means that it will be viewed inside the company less as just a set of successful movies and more like a foundation for an expanding IP that moves deeper into other company divisions, particularly those centered in the US. We've already discussed, again on other episodes, how that new Zootopia attraction in the Tree of Life at Animal Kingdom downplays central Zootopia characters like Nick and Judy to highlight supporting characters such as Clawhauser. Shanghai has already opened a Zootopia land which features a trackless ride and also a lot of Nick and Judy, and almost surely Shanghai got this Zootopia land in part because box office levels in China suggested that this IP would play well in a China-based park. Now the financials at the box office are pointing to a stronger North American interest in this franchise. In my opinion, themed lands in Disney parks largely succeed when they present interesting environments that deeply contrast with the worlds that we can see right outside the park. In using this as a baseline definition, I would say that one of the least successful lands in any of the America Disney parks is Avengers Campus. It's supposed to look like a 20th century industrial site, and it feels just like that. And that concept doesn't have a lot of deep visual interest in terms of the environment, even if the characters there are engaging. On the other end of the spectrum are Galaxy's Edge and Pandora, which, through the design of a unique place, bring us as guests into film-inspired worlds deeply different from the realms that we experience outside of the parks. The world of Zootopia is a colorful, whimsical mix of nature and urban environments that would easily lend itself to a city-structured land inside of a Disney park or parks to give that space a unique, exotic feel. The more money that this new film makes at the domestic box office, the more likely that the company will strongly consider this franchise as a basis for a land or an expansion area at a domestic park as well. In Florida, Hollywood Studios and Animal Kingdom seem like the likely contenders for a Zootopia area. Hollywood Studios is already arranged, for the most part, as a set of expanded themed lands around film franchises, but I think this theme would fit a little better over at Animal Kingdom. It also might solve two problems for that particular park. Animal Kingdom lacks family rides directed at and suitable for younger visitors. And then there's always this ongoing problem, specifically, what can Disney put out at Conservation Station so that guests actually come out there? I'm pretty sure that guests would make the trip out there for a Zootopia land, and if memory serves correct, isn't a train how Judy Hopps originally got to Zootopia the city in the first movie? Likewise, with Zootopia 2 now in the top 10, I would think that WDI would be seriously looking at ways to integrate this property into the Disneyland Forward expansion projects for California. But regardless, with the domestic box office for Zootopia 2, the Zootopia IP will now be viewed within the company as a type of foundational IP, like Frozen or Toy Story, for a multi-generational audience whose characters exist outside of the stories and experiences in the film, whose narratives become part of the company's contemporary identity, and will be seen as a safe bet for long-term high-cost investments. And by that I mean the development of a full land as opposed to a relatively low-cost retheming of an existing show space inside the Tree of Life. So I think the signs are pointing to an expanded presence of Zootopia in the American parks after the current round of construction finishes up both in California and Florida. Basically, I think we're going to see a little more of Nick and Judy and even Gary DeSnake in the parks in the coming years, which will leave Imagineering with an interesting issue for them to overcome. The directors of Zootopia 2, including reptiles, learned that it was harder to make snakes appear deeply relatable to people, specifically children, because you couldn't put clothes on them aside from glasses and maybe a collar. Most of the Zootopia characters appear immediately relatable to children because they have arms and legs, and then human clothes can be arranged on those bodies. With Gary DeSnake, artists mostly made him relatable by rounding out his appearance and giving him child-friendly personality traits, such as feeling misunderstood, wanting to belong, and appearing gentle but also awkward. This will be a little tougher sell in a theme park where there's more emphasis on visual presentation to define personality and less so on narrative movements. So it will be interesting to see how Imagineering works through this particular issue, if in fact a higher domestic box office of Zootopia 2 leads to a Zootopia land or area or areas in a domestic park or parks, which I think now is becoming a little more likely. Our next story is about a feature article in the Wall Street Journal, focused on the plight of Imagineering during the time of CEO Bob Chapek. This is an article that received a lot of play online in the past couple of weeks. The article also has a backstory, essentially the recent boom and bust swings of Disney Imagineering and by extension the American parks. The American parks were on a boom cycle in the 20-teens, but then, starting around 2015, when Bob Chapek became chairman of Walt Disney Parks and Resorts, which back then oversaw Imagineering, he forced Imagineering to stick to budget, which led to cuts to large projects. If you've ever wondered why Galaxy's Edge opened with less than planned, this here is likely the answer. 5 years later, when Bob Chapek became the company's CEO, the situation got worse for Imagineering. Anyone who regularly listens to this podcast already knows how this story played out. Chapek, as CEO, particularly in 2021 and 2022, diverted revenue from the park, some of which would have normally gone back to develop new attractions, to instead shore up the struggling Disney streamer, Disney+, leaving Imagineering with no meaningful budgets to develop large new attractions that would in turn drive large visitation to the Disney parks, particularly those parks that Disney fully owns, such as the parks in Florida, California, and France. The other international Disney parks tended to get more new attractions and lands during this period, as the money to develop those lands and attractions came from, or partially came from, other entities, as Disney was largely a part owner or licensor for those properties. But also here, let me break this down into specific figures. In 2019, Disney invested around $5 billion in the Disney parks. And then in November 2019, Disney Plus launched. Then, the following year in 2020, Bob Chapek became CEO of Disney, and by 2021, Chapek had slashed the company's investment in the Disney-owned parks by over 50%. Specifically, a 53.5% reduction in capital investments, down from nearly $5 billion a year to $2.27 billion. Investment in the park stayed roughly in that range for 2022, and then at the end of 2022, Bob Chapek was removed from the role of CEO by the Disney board. In 2023, the first year that Iger was fully back as CEO, investment levels for the parks returned to their pre-Chapek levels, again just under $5 billion. But that left a 2-year hole in which little was being developed, which would result in a 2-year gap in which little of size would come to the American parks. We're in that gap right now. To solve these problems, Disney has essentially given Imagineering additional funds to make up for lost time. Investment was up to $8 billion in 2025 and is projected to be $9 billion for 2026. So that's part of the backstory here. But in all this, there's still one other interesting area of context. Specifically, Disney gave the Wall Street Journal permission to interview its employees with some oversight as to what information would be shared with readers. That typically means that Disney believed that this article would have a mostly positive effect on the company, particularly in terms of institutional investment and a rising stock price. For nearly 4 years now, Disney has struggled to move its share price above $110. An article about Disney placed in the Wall Street Journal would largely be directed at individuals involved in finance and investment, which are one large demographic of the journal's readers. And we'll talk about that a little more at the end of this article, because even after reading this article a couple of times, I'm still sort of confused as to exactly what Disney is trying to accomplish here. But this generally is what is revealed in this article. There's some puff paragraphs about expansion to the Disney Cruise Line, and a hype paragraph or two about projects coming to the American Disney parks. But at the heart of the article is a discussion about how Imagineering worked with changing budget targets, specifically to create strategies to create high-quality attractions by underestimating the total final budget. Imagineers, according to the article, called this practice progressive seduction. I'll read you a couple of sentences from the article that sets all of this up. Some Imagineers saw executives as an obstacle that needed to be overcome. They sometimes used a practice internally known as progressive seduction to get approval for projects at a smaller scale and then suggest one seemingly small improvement at a time until it was as big as they actually wanted it to be, a person with knowledge of the matter said. Again, I should point out the article doesn't say when these specific practices occurred, but as financial information in the article overall mostly focuses on the last 8 years, essentially from the opening of Pandora at Animal Kingdom up to the present, I'd say there's at least the suggestion that this took place in recent years, perhaps as a way to combat some recent budget cuts. The article offers, as an example, Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run, which was designed to have 5 different adventures but got only one due to budget cuts. Longtime listeners here also know that in addition to a reduced Smuggler's Run, Galaxy's Edge lost its planned table service restaurant and dinner show, a slow-moving scenic ride where guests, at least in the California version of Galaxy's Edge, would ride on the back of a bantha around the edge of the land, drones dressed like Star Wars ships flying high overhead, and outdoor stunt shows featuring characters from the movies, though technically the show cuts came from Disneyland's entertainment division, not Imagineering. After attendance initially rose, both in California and Florida following the opening of Galaxy's Edge, the American parks with minimal investment have seen flat attendance despite new hotels and DVC timeshares opening both in Florida and California. The parks have shown increased revenue, but that mainly comes from rising prices, not from selling more tickets or bringing more people to the parks. The article concludes by pointing to a new adventure coming to Smuggler's Run, featuring The Mandalorian and Grogu, which will premiere in May. The article also points to new developments of scale, specifically to Villain's Land at the Magic Kingdom, as a type of project not only designed to engage Imagineers, but also increase demand and visitation at the parks. But basically, what this article defined was a multi-year contentious relationship between Imagineering and the C-suite over at the Disney studio. From my perspective, what Imagineers wanted to build would have actually helped improve the parks, increased attendance, and expanded revenue, which are all good things, but that's not how all of this went down. So why then did Disney participate in creating this article, which mostly centered on a contentious relationship within the company? Well, from a certain perspective, the article in part was designed to suggest that financial problems that some company watchers have speculated about were both true, but were now behind the company as well. Instead of a period of progressive seduction and doctored cost estimates, Imagineering would now be moving forward with large plans and a corresponding large budget to develop new lands. This, I'm guessing, was designed to encourage investment, specifically institutional investment in Disney stock, by painting a picture of Disney as a company moving toward a period of strong growth. The suggestion is that these new developments should increase the company's value, which then would be eventually reflected in a higher stock price. But the lasting impression I had from this article was this. Though there are signs of coming change, such as new lands, there are also some unknown elements in this mix as well, most of which was ignored by the article. Current CEO Bob Iger's contract ends in 2026, after which he's supposed to step down. It's possible that the next CEO continues on with Iger's capital priorities in terms of the parks, but it's also possible that the next CEO and their team moves in a slightly different direction. Case in point, this is one reason right here why so many teams are trying to get land cleared quickly and have steel go vertical inside the parks. If steel is already framing in a show building for your project, it's kind of difficult for the company to cancel those plans. You've probably noticed on the web recently, Disney has released photos and videos of new ride buildings being developed both in Florida and California. Those images aren't so much to get the public excited as they are to indicate to the incoming management that these projects are too far along to be cut. There's even a little bit of work being done on Villains Land, a project that has no opening date, and I think we would be lucky to see it here by 2030 or 2031. But the talk around this is almost surely to cast the impression that the project is going forward. But from what I've seen of the project myself, I think so little has been done here that it would still be easy to cut if a new CEO had different priorities, or perhaps more realistically, if America entered a significant recession. Of those projects that I think are now too far along to cut are the Piston Peak Cars area at the Magic Kingdom, the expansion area to Avengers Campus at DCA, Monsters Incorporated land and the revised animation courtyard at Hollywood Studios, and of course Tropical Americas at Animal Kingdom. A little more iffy on that list of expected developments are the Coco ride at DCA, the Pandora expansion also at DCA, and of course Villains Land. Beneath this article, though, there's another discussion going on, specifically as to what type of growth Disney offers potential investors. Traditionally, investors seek out Disney because it's a reliable, stable investment with good dividends, high overall value through its IP, and low levels of risk. Essentially, it's a durable, diversified company that has performed reasonably well over many decades. But the sexiest companies for some investors right now are tech companies with the potential for short-term high growth, and also the possibility for high loss. Traditionally, investors seek out Disney as a stable, long-term investment with minimal risk, while investors seek out other companies like NVIDIA for short or mid-term opportunities to maximize capital appreciation, but with an understanding that such investments carry high-risk loads. In the Wall Street Journal article, Disney seems to want to present itself a little more like a tech company that can quickly scale up. But from where I sit, I don't think that's what Disney really is or should be, especially now that the company is over 100 years old. New companies scale up during a period of rapid growth. Older companies do other things well. Disney functions best with steady, regular investments in its parks, films, and other entertainments, making very regular and reliable strides for growth, which is how Disneyland, over 70 years, gave way to a set of Disney resorts and parks around the globe, each of which itself has grown over time. That is, Disney as both a company and as an investment functions best as a low-risk, long-term holding that offers a very reliable but steady growth, just like it did from 2010 to 2020. And it doesn't work well during boom-bust cycles. For this, I'm thinking of the period between 2020 and 2025, with the current boom in investment being a reaction to an earlier period of low funding to Imagineering. But my hope here is that the lessons of the Chapek era stay with the company now, and we will return to a long period of regular investments in the parks. But all of that is in the future and also dependent on the next set of executives and the financial conditions in the years ahead. There's one more little takeaway from this article that I want to highlight before we push on. In discussions with people at Imagineering, the author of the article explained that Villain's Land, and here I will quote, will feature characters from Snow White, Peter Pan, and Aladdin. All of this, of course, has been announced or hinted at before. I had assumed that Hook and the Evil Queen would be included as top-tier villains, but beyond them in those top-tier spots, I would have added, the Queen of Hearts, or Cruella de Vil, or Maleficent, or Ursula, or even Chernabog from Fantasia. That Jafar from Aladdin came up in a list of 3 that are going to be included in Villain's Land might suggest that there could be a slightly larger presence of Aladdin in this new villains area, assuming it all gets built, compared to what I was expecting before I read the article. For our last section, we'll switch over to Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland. About a dozen years ago, the original plan, as laid out by Imagineering, was to theme Galaxy's Edge after the original Star Wars trilogy. Specifically a world that looked like Tatooine from the first Star Wars film, A New Hope, with Mos Eisley's Cantina and so on. Over on Lou Mongello's podcast some time ago, Dan Cockerell, former vice president of 3 different Florida Disney parks, explained how the original trilogy plan back during its design period was put aside when Kathleen Kennedy, then president of Lucasfilm, took a meeting with Disney's CEO Bob Iger. Here's what Dan said about that experience. Kathleen Kennedy, her point was, there are way more Disney Star Wars stories ahead of us than behind us. So we really should think about, do we want to build a Tatooine and build what all the 50-somethings remember Star Wars is, or do we want to build something which is going to appeal to all the upcoming generations? When this meeting took place, Disney believed that the sequel trilogy with Rey and Kylo Ren would likely become the central Star Wars story for younger fans. But this didn't really happen. The first film in that sequel trilogy, The Force Awakens, did well at the box office. In terms of the domestic take, it pulled in $936 million. The next film in the trilogy pulled in 33% less money, and then the third and final film pulled in 45% less than The Force Awakens, coming in at $515 million. Or you can look at this trend this way. The Force Awakens has the 6th highest worldwide lifetime gross. The second film in the trilogy, The Last Jedi, comes in at 23, and the final film comes in at 43. But by the time the second and third films in the trilogy had come out and were less successful than anticipated, Galaxy's Edge was being built and being themed to a very specific moment in the sequel trilogy timeline, essentially between Star Wars 8, The Last Jedi, and Star Wars 9, The Rise of Skywalker. The locked timeline would allow for some immersive play, particularly with the Galactic Starcruiser experience, in which guests at that Star Wars hotel would feel that they were moving through a specific period of the Star Wars saga. But after Galaxy's Edge opened, many guests expressed the desire to see characters beyond those in the sequel trilogy, Specifically, they wanted to see original trilogy characters, such as Luke, Han Solo, Princess Leia, and especially Darth Vader. The problem? Some of these characters, such as Darth Vader and Han Solo, were long dead by the time of the 8th film, and other characters such as Luke and Leia looked significantly older than their iconic presentations in the original trilogy. After all, there were 42 years between the release of the first and last film in the Skywalker saga. Another common complaint was the lack of familiar John Williams music in Galaxy's Edge, except for inside the two rides. Back in 2019 here on the podcast, we explored the rationale for this, but essentially it was an attempt for a deeper sense of immersion inside the land. What now might be seen as an over-immersion, or an immersion to the level that worked against a sense of guest enjoyment and expectations. I'll recap the issue of the land's soundscape quickly. An audience in a theater would hear John Williams' music up on the screen, but characters in the film, assuming they were real, wouldn't hear the music, only the sounds of nearby machinery, engines, droids, and other characters. So to make guests in Galaxy's Edge feel like they were inside of the movie instead of in a theater watching it, Imagineers decided to only include the sounds that the characters would hear. For those with a good memory from our exploration of this a few years ago, that is the difference between diegetic sound, which are the sounds the characters would hear if they were real, and non-diegetic sounds, which are the sounds such as a musical soundtrack that an audience would hear in the theater. It was, I will fully concede, an interesting experience. The problem that many guests pointed out was this: a very common entry point into the energy of the Star Wars drama was the music itself. Music, guests explained, was a powerful tool to engage the emotional memory they had when first watching those films. After watching the films for decades, it was now difficult for many guests to move from the experience of watching Star Wars on screen with music to being in a Star Wars land without that music. Or to put it simply, the sound of the Imperial March, which is Darth Vader's famous theme, for many inspired a sense of awe and grandeur, which they wanted to feel while in Galaxy's Edge. The hissing steam vents, the hum of a portable generator, a few droid bleeps, and the uneven rumble of a starfighter trying to start up doesn't offer the same narrative majesty and emotional engagement as the familiar film music. And let me just point out something we explored a couple of weeks ago here on the podcast. Part of these differences relate to that question of what do guests really want inside of a theme park. Do they want to take on the role of spectators, sort of like watching a movie in a theater, but in a theme park the film presentation would be all around them? Or do they want to be in the movie themselves? I know we usually discuss this in theme park circles as a binary option, but maybe a large number of guests might want something in between, to occupy a halfway or quarter-way point, where guests are mostly distant spectators but can occasionally step into the movie and briefly pretend to be a resident there. The original development of Galaxy's Edge not only put guests in a timeline between the 8th and 9th films in that saga, but also in an environmental space that assumed they'd want to role-play in that world. But neither of these design choices turned out to be universally popular with guests. So it's probably no coincidence that these next two announcements happened at almost the same time. On January 15th, after a couple of months of rumored speculations, Kathleen Kennedy announced that she would step down from her role as president of Lucasfilm. This was a simple retirement, nothing more. Kennedy was 72 and had served as president for 14 years. On January 14th, Disney announced it would step away from the original plan for Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland, that plan that Kennedy originally wanted, and shift to a plan that better embraced the original trilogy, at least in some areas of Galaxy's Edge. I'd lay money here that the initial plan was to announce the changes to Galaxy's Edge just after the announcement of Kennedy's retirement. But again, that's just a guess, and regardless, these two announcements happened within a day of each other. It would be very difficult to retheme all of Galaxy's Edge to a different timeline, as its featured attraction, Rise of the Resistance, is deeply centered on the characters of Kylo Ren, Rey, BB-8, and others. But as we've discussed in our last segment, Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run was always designed to host multiple experiences, so updating that ride to an experience that was at least closer to the original trilogy would be doable. Smuggler's Run is mostly managed by a game engine, which makes content changes a whole lot easier. Change video for the wraparound screens, change the audio, and reprogram what buttons and levers guests are supposed to push, pull, and move while in motion. So why is Disneyland getting the larger package with the fully broken timeline, the new ride experience, and multiple new characters? And why is Florida just getting the new ride experience by itself? I believe that there are a few reasons that Disneyland is getting these elements, at least initially. The first is to test out how the public will receive an updated land. The second, Galaxy's Edge at Hollywood Studios in Florida, due to its placement on the main park loop, tends to be busy all day long and well into the night. Galaxy's Edge over at Disneyland, however, as it's at the far back end of the park, what used to be backstage corrals and barns, tends to be fairly empty at night. Galaxy's Edge there is not on the way to any other lands. If Disney can put more guests in Disneyland's Galaxy's Edge at night, it will help reduce nighttime crowding elsewhere in the park by spreading guests more uniformly throughout the entire property. Third, at the moment, WDI is trying to spin this as positive, that there will be subtly different Galaxy's Edge experiences on the two coasts. I'm not so sure I believe this, but that was part of the press talk. And fourth, and this is one of the big reasons, there's very, very little in terms of new experiences coming to Disneyland this summer. Over at Walt Disney World, there's no big e-tickets opening, but there will be significant updates to Big Thunder, a revised Space Ranger spin, a new movie for Soarin', a revamped Rock and Roller Coaster with the Muppets, and a meet and greet with Bluey at Animal Kingdom. At Disneyland, up until this announcement was made, there was only a Bluey stage show and also that same new movie for DCA's version of Soarin'. New experiences are important drivers for both the resort in Florida and the resort in California, but the tourism patterns are very different for the two coasts. Large e-ticket experiences are a better driver for increased visitation in Florida, as visiting Disney World typically means buying a plane ticket and getting a hotel. But smaller experiences can be important drivers of visitation and tourism for the Disneyland Resort in California. The primary guest radius for Disneyland is about 100 miles. From within that 100-mile radius, the parks receive about 65% of their guests. These people mostly drive in during the morning and then drive home at night. Because the overall cost of a Disneyland visit is lower, at least for this group, no plane, no hotel, no rental car, locals will plan a visit to see smaller additions such as a partial makeover of Galaxy's Edge. Anyway, these are some reasons why it's going to California, at least at first. So what does this all mean for Galaxy's Edge in California? Galaxy's Edge will lose its fixed time frame. it will now have a reasonably open timeline, but will have two distinct areas. The characters that exist in the original trilogy and some surrounding years, such as Darth Vader, a younger Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, the Mandalorian, and Grogu, will appear in the upper area, that is, in the Black Spire outpost itself around the Millennium Falcon. The characters of the sequel trilogy, such as Rey, Chewie, and R2, will shift to the forest area around Rise of the Resistance, as there's no easy way to align Rise of the Resistance with the original trilogy. But even here, of those characters that are moving over to the area around Rise of the Resistance, only one of them is unique to the sequel trilogy. The other two are far better known for their roles in the original trilogy. Kylo Ren, who for me has always been a little like a less interesting version of Darth Vader, will be moved out of Galaxy's Edge entirely. He will appear in a meet and greet in Tomorrowland. And honestly, I'm not sure how long he'll be popular there. If given a choice for a photo op between Kylo and Darth, I think that most guests will want to go see Darth over in Galaxy's Edge. In this, Galaxy's Edge will function a little more like Fantasyland, with no fixed timeline. Fantasyland presents highlights of popular characters from multiple animated Disney films, such as Snow White, which is assumed to be set a few hundred years ago in Germany, and right down the way, Peter Pan, which is set in the early 20th century in England. Guests in that area of the park move through a land where the rides are all thematically connected, they're all based on animated fairy tales, rather than through a land arranged around film events that are on a fixed timeline. I know that some regular visitors will see this announcement as a confirmation that the vast majority of theme park guests don't want to engage in ongoing participatory play, and that may be true. But outside of the Star Wars Hotel, I don't think this was ever really tested for any length of time in the parks. In terms of this area of change, I think the takeaway doesn't speak so much to guest behavior, but rather to cost. Simply, it was too costly to have ongoing immersive play in the parks, as that play needed to be managed by actors on stage who frame and engage the drama, and then also a team working behind the scenes to oversee the evolving experience. Perhaps this worked financially for a high-touch offering like the Star Wars Hotel, which as a 2-day interactive experience cost between $4,000 and $5,000 for a family of 4, but this arrangement was not viable or practical inside of a theme park where the operations and entertainment departments have a far smaller budget per guest per day than did the Star Wars Hotel. As mentioned, the revised Smuggler's Run will loosely anchor the Black Spire outpost to an area around the original trilogy. The Mandalorian takes place a few years after the original trilogy, so the revised Smuggler's Run attraction with Mando will not only feature locations first introduced in the original trilogy like Bespin, but also iconic locations from just after the end of the original trilogy, such as the decaying wreckage of the second Death Star after it was blown up in Return of the Jedi. Darth Vader will now appear in the Black Spire outpost section of Batuu, presumably looking for Luke, while Luke presumably is on Batuu looking for ancient materials related to Jedi lore and history. My guess here? This backstory will be discussed in park for only a few months, until these encounters turn into typical meet and greets, with more outgoing fans trying to strike up conversations with the characters with little regard to any timeline-specific backstory or other planned narrative elements. Beyond the new characters and the new experience inside of Smuggler's Run, shops will update their merchandise, losing products tied to the First Order and stocking new items tied to an earlier period in the Star Wars timeline. Oga's Cantina will close for many weeks both as a general refurbishment and also to better align the interior details with the original trilogy. The backstory here will change. The bar will still be owned by Oga, but Oga will no longer be a well-connected underworld figure. Instead, as Oga will now be 3 decades younger, Oga will be fairly new to running the bar. When it reopens, at times you should be able to hear the original Cantina band track in the bar. Almost surely some of the signage and props will be updated, but exactly how this plays out hasn't yet been discussed. I would expect this to be a typical refurbishment combined with some light retheming. So now a few final thoughts on all of these changes. First, if you want to see Galaxy's Edge with all of these character additions, I'd go to Disneyland this summer. Historically, Disneyland has a history of cutbacks to entertainment's budgets, which usually means that the park needs to cut back on character experiences, which is exactly what we have here. As a point of comparison, exactly how long did that Resistance spy, the Moradi, last in Galaxy's Edge after it opened? I think that spy was there for less than a year. And yes, I know the pandemic played into that a little bit, but the point is, some of the characters originally placed in Galaxy's Edge back in 2019 slowly left. The same might be true here moving forward. Second, there's going to be some pretty awkward conversations between younger guests and cast members wanting to know why the best known and most easily identifiable characters in Galaxy's Edge aren't on either of the rides except for, of course, Chewie. I'd be interested to hear how cast members are going to answer that one. Lastly, the big question, at least for some of you, will be this. Will these additions come to Florida? Despite WDI framing that it's a positive thing that each Galaxy's Edge will have a slightly different experience, Galaxy's Edge in Florida continues to step away from a firm timeline as well. This May, Hollywood Studios will also get that Mando and Grogu version of Smuggler's Run, which takes place 5 or 6 years after the original trilogy, but close to 3 decades before episodes 8 and 9. By that I mean, at this point, no one in Florida is deeply invested in the fixed timeline anymore, and that press nods to it now are mostly about marketing. The reason the updates are going to California are fairly clear. Disneyland had a greater need for this initial update to draw visitors to the park over summer, and also to better distribute guests in the park across the entire property. So I see this mostly as a test to gauge how popular it will be. But there's a little more to the answer of will it actually come to Florida? And for that I have a more complicated answer. I know it's easy to think of the Disney company as a single entity, but I believe it's a little more accurate to think of the Walt Disney Company as about 30 reasonably discrete companies, each with their own budgets, which then reports back to the same executive suite. And then each of those 30 companies has departments or divisions, again, each with their own budgets. And here's how money plays into all of this. Some of the costs for the new Smuggler's Run experience are tied to Imagineering, which is centralized to serve multiple parks. But the cost to place the new walk-around characters inside of the revised Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland will almost surely come from the entertainment division and its budget within Disneyland. So locally, someone at Disneyland has signed off on these additions as being cost-effective in terms of boosting revenue that goes directly back to Disneyland. And to get these character changes over to Hollywood Studios in Florida, some managers there would also need to decide that these additions would not only be beneficial in terms of the overall presentation of Galaxy's Edge, but would also be beneficial in terms of revenue for their park, either through admissions, food sales, merchandise, and so on. And that becomes a far more nuanced argument to make, especially since Galaxy's Edge is reasonably well attended in Florida right now. But to get up to that point, where this update perhaps eventually migrates over to Florida, we'll first need to see how popular these editions are in California. The character and timeline editions will arrive in California on April 29th, roughly along with the Season of the Force, and the Mando and Grogu update to Smuggler's Run will arrive both in California and Florida on May 22nd. And so to tie all of this up today, all of these updates for Galaxy's Edge play into the larger motifs that we've been discussing on the podcast for the past year or so. A very careful and intricate dance to boost visitation to the parks when the only real levers management can pull are attraction rethemes and offerings through entertainment, at least until some of those large post-Chapek projects can start to come online. But even under the most optimistic conditions, we're still about 18 to 22 months until any of those projects can open, and so until then, especially if you're in California, we will just have to enjoy those things that are coming to Galaxy's Edge. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Also, if you haven't yet got a copy of Making Mary Poppins, I did notice that over on Amazon they were on sale this past week, and so hopefully that sale continues into the current week. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.